In the last video, we talked about the impeachment of Johnson, that he was more of a moderate Republican, and these radical, these ones that really wanted to ensure that slavery and all this can't happen ever again, and wanted to be very punitive. They really wanted to punish the South for all the destruction they felt that the South had caused on the country. And so we talked about the impeachment of President Johnson, and he was acquitted by one vote. But what they were finding is they were having these southern states come back to the Union, and one of the requirements in that federal law of 1866, the Reconstruction Act, by the radical Republicans was you have to go with the 13th Amendment. Now remember, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in our country, said forever it can't be there. The 14th Amendment, that was another requirement for the for the states to include, to be readmitted, was the idea that if you're born here, you're a citizen. You know, so all these millions of freedmen now are citizens of the United States. They have full equal right to that citizenship. But what they were finding is, as we mentioned in the earlier video, that the military had come down from the north, and they had these military districts, and they were run by top brass military, and they were ensuring that these freedmen could now vote, which politically, you know, was going to help the Republican Party. And then you had, like I said, 10 to 15,000 whites, Southern whites, who were denied the right to vote because of their rebellion. And so, you know, these Southerners, there was such a resentment to the idea of, you're taking away my vote because I fought for my state's rights and my rights to own property, and you're giving it to someone who used to be my slave. And so what was happening in many of the districts within the South, the voting districts, was they would create things to prevent the freed African Americans from exercising their right to vote. And so African American men were granted the right to vote in 1870, but there was no guarantee with that law that African American men could get access to the polls. So they would do things like, well, if you can read, then you can vote. There were lots of qualifications, and so many of these freedmen, these ex-slaves, they were never literate, they were never taught to read or write, so then they couldn't vote, they couldn't exercise their rights. So the radical Republicans were hearing of this, and they said, no, we are going to pass an amendment to ensure that these freed slaves would have the right to vote. And as Africans began to exercise and go to the polls and go vote, they would be harassed, they would be beat up, some would be killed. And so there was all these things that were being inflicted upon these freedmen to prevent them from exercising their right to vote. Some of the things that they did was a literacy test. You'd have to be able to read before you could vote. You'd have a poll tax. And a polling place, when you take a poll, you are adding up numbers. And so a polling place is what you call the place where people go to vote. And so they would say, in order to vote, you have to pay a tax. And there were other voter qualifications to prevent African Americans from voting. And this became very, very common. And so the radical Republicans in Congress said, no, we're passing this 15th Amendment to make it absolutely illegal for anybody in the South who would try to prevent these new freedmen from exercising their right to vote. Now, it's very interesting, though, that this was the beginning, the stirrings of women saying, well, if you're letting ex-slaves get to vote, what is the problem with giving women the right to vote? And this was the beginning of the stirrings of the women's suffrage movement. in suffrage they're talking about earning the right to vote. The South reacts to the radical Republicans. They come down, there's all this legislation, there's all these, you have to do this, you have to do that, and we're going to impose this on you. And like anything that happens, if you get that between two people, or two bigger groups of people, or two countries, there's always pushback, always pushback. So the South began to create things to limit the influence and the power that the North and these laws were doing. One of the things is they created the black codes, and we're going to go into those in detail. And these were certain laws that would be passed that would prevent the blacks from having equal access and exercising their equal rights. That one of the ways they would do this is white supremacist groups began to form, like the Ku Klux Klan. They did restrictions. These are all the methods that the South had come up with as pushback to the North requiring these things in the radical Reconstruction. The literacy test, the poll tax, the grandfather clause. This was something we hadn't talked about yet that's very important. You can vote if your grandfather voted. Well, how many of these freedmen, how many of these ex-slaves could their grandfather vote? So this law was a very convenient way to exclude them from exercising their rights as citizens. Now, what were the black codes? The black codes were laws and constitutional amendments enacted by ex-Confederate states following the Civil War. So when they created their new state constitutions, these new state legislatures in these southern states began to pass these laws. And the purpose of these laws were to restrict the new rights gained by the newly freed slaves. So their intent was to say, whoa, they're freed, emancipated, this 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, we don't think so. It's not going to happen. So they start passing laws to counteract that. These restricted laws ensured a supply of inexpensive agricultural labor and maintained white control, both economically and politically. And this is kind of we're going to break this apart a bit to really clarify what I mean. So for example, they would use intimidation. Ex-slave would come to vote, and they would intimidate him. They would pull him in the back. They would threaten him with his life and say, you're not voting. You want to live? Don't vote. You want to die? Vote. And so that was very much the intimidation aspect. The whole idea with the Ku Klux Klan and the white supremacy, that the idea that they were just inherently, they're just better. In terms of the species, they were a better species. That whites knew more, Africans were not as advanced or developed as the white race. So the whole idea that whites really need to manage and take care of the Africans because they just were inept. They weren't able to. We will look at more of this in the next video.